There's a quiet understanding among men, a truth passed down not in words but in calloused hands and tired shoulders. It's the deep-seated belief that a man's worth, his very fiber, is woven from the strength of his back, the firmness of his grip, and the sweat that stings his eyes after a long, honest day. We watch fathers, grandfathers, brothers defining themselves by what they can lift, what they can build, what they can endure with nothing but their own two hands. We learn early that to be strong is to be dependable, to be able to stand tall against the world's relentless push, to carry the weight without complaint. And sometimes, it takes losing everything we thought defined that strength to finally understand what it really means to be strong at all. There was a man who lived by that very creed, a man forged in the heat and grit of a place where strength wasn't just admired, it was essential. His name was Wyatt, and at 48 years old he carried the marks of a life well-lived and hard-earned, etched deep into him like slag on the sides of a furnace. You saw it first in his hands, not soft, never soft, but the kind of hands that told stories without a single word. Thick knuckles, scarred palms, fingers slightly bent from years of gripping wrenches, hammers, and the unyielding mass of raw steel. They were hands that knew how to work, how to fix, how to provide. They were honest hands. Wyatt stood about 6 feet, maybe an inch or two under, but he filled the space around him with a quiet, unshakable presence. His shoulders were broad, still powerful, though the lean muscle wasn't as defined as it once was. His uniform was simple. Thick, faded work shirts, jeans that had seen more grease and grime than detergent, and heavy work boots that had trampled miles of concrete and metal grate. A fine layer of industrial dust seemed to cling to him, not dirtying him, but settling into the very fabric of his being, a testament to where he spent his days. His face was a map of his 48 years. Lines fanned out from the corners of his eyes, etched deeper when he squinted against the sun or the glare of a cutting torch. His jaw was strong, often set, hinting at a deep stubbornness that was as much a flaw as it was a driving force. But it was his eyes that held you. They were a muted blue-gray, usually quiet, observant, missing nothing. They'd seen enough hard days to carry a perpetual weariness, a knowledge of struggle, but beneath that, there was an unwavering resolve that glowed like embers under ash. You wouldn't catch Wyatt wasting words. He was the type to listen more than he spoke, to absorb the room, and when he did offer something, it often came with a dry, understated joke that caught you off guard and made you crack a smile. It was his way of letting you know he was there, he was present, and he hadn't entirely given up on finding a bit of light in the dimness. He was a steelworker, same as his old man, same as his grandfather. Not some fancy engineer in a clean shirt and a hard hat, but a man on the floor in the thick of it. He knew the language of steel, the roar of the furnace, the hiss of quenching water, the groan of bending metal. He could feel the heat through his boots, the vibration in his bones. For nearly 30 years, his world had been a symphony of industry, a harsh ballet of strength and sweat under a sky perpetually stained by fire and soot. This was where he belonged. This was where he made his mark, literally, shaping the world one beam, one plate, one girder at a time. And every morning, when he pulled on those heavy boots and cinched his belt tight, he felt a certain pride, a quiet certainty that he was doing exactly what he was meant to do. His worth, he figured, was self-evident in the labor he offered, dependable and uncomplaining. They say a man's worth is measured by his hands, by the calluses that tell stories of toil, the grip that never falters, the honest ache in his bones at the end of a long, hard day. For generations, in towns built on smoke and steel, this wasn't just a saying, it was scripture. It was how you knew who you were and what you stood for. And Wyatt, bless his stubborn heart, believed it more than most. Wyatt was 48, though the years etched on his face suggested a few more had tried to settle there. He wasn't built like a bodybuilder, all show and bulk, but like a river stone, smooth and worn, with an immense, unyielding density. His strength wasn't something he flaunted. It was just there. A quiet truth evident in the way he carried himself, in the slow, deliberate movements that spoke of purpose and power. His hands, the very symbols of his belief, were a testament to a life lived in the crucible. Knuckles gnarled like roots, palms cross-hatched with lines deeper than any fortune teller could read, fingers thick and strong, stained with the permanent grime of iron and oil. They knew the feel of cold steel, the bite of a wrench, the punishing vibration of a jackhammer. They were tools, extensions of his will, capable of both brute force and surprising finesse when the job called for it. His eyes, set deep beneath heavy brows, were the color of faded denim, carrying the echo of 1,000 sunrises over the mill. They'd seen enough fire and shadow to hold a perpetual weariness, a knowledge of struggle, but beneath that, there was an unwavering resolve that glowed like embers under ash. You wouldn't catch Wyatt wasting words. He was the type to listen more than he spoke, to absorb the room, and when he did offer something, it often came with a dry, understated joke that caught you off guard and made you crack a smile. It was his way of letting you know he was there, he was present, and he hadn't entirely given up on finding a bit of light in the dimness. He was a steelworker, same as his old man, same as his grandfather. Not some fancy engineer in a clean shirt and a hard hat, but a man on the floor in the thick of it. He knew the language of steel, the roar of the furnace, the hiss of quenching water, the groan of bending metal. He could feel the heat through his boots, the vibration in his bones. For nearly 30 years, his world had been a symphony of industry, a harsh ballet of strength and sweat under a sky perpetually stained by fire and soot. This was where he belonged. This was where he made his mark, literally, shaping the world one beam, one plate, one girder at a time. And every morning when he pulled on those heavy boots and cinched his belt tight, he felt a certain pride, a quiet certainty that he was doing exactly what he was meant to do. His worth, he figured, was self-evident in the labor he offered, dependable and uncomplaining. The alarm, set with military precision, didn't so much ring as it screamed at 4:45 a.m. Not 5 a.m., but 4:45, a quarter-hour head start on the inevitable rush, a small act of defiance against the day. Wyatt would swing his legs out of bed, the old springs groaning in protest, and stand, feeling the familiar aches in his knees and lower back already announcing their presence. Coffee was always first, strong, black, made in a percolator his wife, Alina, had bought him years ago. He'd sip it standing at the kitchen window, watching the streetlights cut through the pre-dawn gloom, the world outside still and quiet before it roared to life. His breakfast was always the same. 2 pieces of toast, sometimes an egg if he felt fancy, eaten in silence. The house was quiet, too quiet since Alina left him alone in it. Her scent, a mix of lavender and something distinctly her, had faded from the pillows years ago, but the silence still echoed with her absence, a constant, low hum in the background of his life. The drive to the mill was a procession of other weary souls in their pickups and beat-up sedans, headlights cutting through the darkness. The mill gates loomed, a monstrous silhouette against the first bruised purples of dawn. Inside, it was a different kind of darkness, punctuated by the blinding flashes of molten metal and the orange glow of slag. His station was often at the rolling mill, guiding thick red-hot slabs of steel through monstrous rollers, watching them flatten and stretch under immense pressure. It was a dance of brute force and precision, a skill honed over decades. Every lever pull, every crane movement, every hammer blow, it was ingrained a part of him. The hours blurred into a rhythmic clang and hiss, the heat an oppressive blanket, the smell of ozone and burning metal a constant companion. He worked hard, didn't complain, and came home dusted in fine metal particles and exhaustion. For Wyatt, life had a predictable rhythm. Paycheck came, bills got paid, electric, gas, water, the mortgage on this small, well-maintained house in a neighborhood where folks still looked out for each other, even if they didn't always say much. But lately the rhythm felt off, like a beat was missing or a drum was out of tune. The numbers on the bills seemed to creep up faster than the numbers on his pay stub. He wasn't behind, not yet, but the margin was thinner than a razor's edge. A new roof for his sister's place after that last storm, a broken water heater that couldn't wait, the rising cost of, well, everything. He ran the numbers in his head over his meager dinner, a sandwich and a can of soup, trying to stretch $1 that felt like it was shrinking by the day. He prided himself on being self-sufficient, on needing no help, but the truth was, he was always just one big repair bill or medical emergency away from going under. The quiet hum of the refrigerator in his small kitchen often sounded like the low growl of financial anxiety. He'd sit on his porch sometimes after a long shift, the evening breeze offering little relief from the day's heat. The neighborhood kids would be laughing down the street, their voices carrying on the wind, and Wyatt would watch them, a faint, unbidden ache settling in his chest. He'd lost Alina before they ever got around to having children. It was just one of the roads not taken, one of the dreams buried quietly under the weight of daily life. He remembered a time, a younger Wyatt, who'd sketch ideas on napkins during lunch breaks, designs for custom metal gates, elaborate railings, even abstract sculptures. He'd always had an eye for lines and form, a knack for seeing what a piece of raw metal could be, not just what it was. But the mill, with its dependable hours and steady pay, had called louder. That creative spark, That desire to build something truly unique had been shelved, replaced by the honest, grueling work of the steel plant. Now that younger Wyatt, the one with dreams beyond the mill floor, felt like a ghost. He pushed those thoughts down deep where they couldn't interfere with the job. Because the job, the physical job, was his identity. It was how he provided not just for himself, but in spirit for the ghost of Alina, for his sister when she needed help, for his own quiet pride. To admit weakness, to admit a desire for something else, felt like a betrayal of the man he was supposed to be. His worth was in his strength, in his endurance, in his ability to show up day in and day out and shoulder the burden. That's what he'd always believed. But in the quiet of his house, or under the indifferent stars, a different kind of burden sometimes settled on his shoulders. The weight of unlived possibilities, the fear that he was just a cog, destined to grind away until he wore out, and then what? He worried about that. He worried about being weak, about not being able to provide, about becoming a burden himself. Those were the real ghosts that haunted Wyatt, far more tangible than any fleeting dream. He just kept his head down and kept working, trusting the familiar rhythm of the mill to drown out the quieter, more unsettling beats of his own heart. The air in the rolling mill was always thick, a symphony of industry. The clang of steel on steel, the rumble of conveyor belts, the hiss of hydraulic presses, and the deep, throaty roar of the furnaces. It was the soundtrack to Wyatt's life. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that speared through grimy skylights, illuminating the sweat on men's brows, the grime under their fingernails. Today was no different, or so it seemed. Wyatt was on the finishing line, guiding massive, still-glowing sheets of steel as they cooled and flattened. His muscles ached in that familiar, satisfying way, a testament to a day's honest toil. He liked the feeling of the heat radiating from the metal, a primal energy he felt he understood. He was wrestling with a particularly stubborn plate, adjusting the rollers with a heavy wrench, his focus absolute. His safety helmet was pulled low, safety glasses perched on his nose, protecting him from the sparks that occasionally flew. Overhead, a gantry crane groaned, carrying a colossal I-beam, probably destined for a new skyscraper, a skeleton bone for some giant structure. These cranes were a constant presence, just another part of the mill's mechanical ballet. Wyatt barely registered its movement, his eyes fixed on the shimmering steel beneath his hands. Then, a sound that cut through the cacophony, not just loud but wrong, a sharp metallic shriek like a beast tearing its own flesh. The crane's groan intensified, twisting into a tortured scream, and then a sickening crunch that vibrated through the very floor plates beneath Wyatt's worn boots. He looked up, instinct overriding years of focused labor. The I-beam, the massive, steel behemoth, was no longer moving gracefully. It was listing, swaying wildly, chains snapping with reports like rifle shots. Time seemed to stretch and warp. He saw it, a slow-motion descent heading straight for his section of the line, straight for him. There was a shout, a primal scream from someone nearby, but Wyatt couldn't react. His body, trained for precision and strength, seemed to freeze, rooted to the spot by a terror that seized him from the inside out. He saw the gleam of the steel as it plunged, a dark shadow blotting out the light, growing impossibly fast. He thought for a fleeting, desperate second of Alina, of his sister's kids, of all the things he hadn't done, all the words unsaid. Then not a crash, but an impact, a sound like the world breaking, a blinding flash of white light, followed by an agonizing, searing pain that consumed every nerve ending, a pain that was red and hot and endless. The world tilted violently, and he was thrown, not gently but violently, like a rag doll. The sound of tearing metal, grinding concrete, and then mercifully blackness. The mill, a place of order and power, had become a maelstrom of chaos, and Wyatt, the dependable steelworker, was caught in its unforgiving maw. He woke to the sterile scent of antiseptic and the persistent, rhythmic beep of machines. Not the mill, then. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the dim glow of medical monitors and a sliver of streetlight cutting through a gap in the blinds. A hospital room. The realization came slowly, pushing through a haze of pain and medication. His throat was dry, a sandpaper rasp when he tried to swallow. There was a weight on his chest, a strange, suffocating pressure, and an unbearable ache in his back, a dull, throbbing core of agony that spread outward. He tried to move, to shift, but his body wouldn't obey. His arms responded, heavy and sluggish, but when he attempted to push himself up or even just wiggle his toes, nothing happened. Nothing. A cold dread, far worse than any pain, began to seep into him, starting in his gut and spreading like ice water through his veins. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing it to be a dream, a nightmare born of concussion and fear. He opened them again. The beeping continued. The darkness remained. And his legs from the waist down were just still, a profound, terrifying stillness. "Hello?" he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. No answer. The nurses, the doctors, they were ghosts in the night, leaving him to this silent, terrifying revelation. He ran his hands down his body, trembling fingers meeting only sheets, then the cold, unyielding curve of his own motionless thighs. He pinched hard, hoping for a jolt, any sensation at all. Nothing. It was like they weren't even there, a dead weight connected to him by some cruel trick of the light. Panic began to rise, a bitter bile in his throat. His breath hitched shallow and fast. He was Wyatt, the steelworker. He worked. He lifted. He stood for 12 hours straight. His legs were his livelihood, his strength, his pride. What was he without them? He pictured himself on the mill floor, strong, capable, then compared it to this inert lump beneath the sheets. The contrast was a punch to the gut. The man who defined himself by his physical ability, by the sweat and strain of honest labor, was gone. Replaced by what? A broken thing, trapped in a bed, reliant on wires and tubes. The fear of weakness, the very fear that had haunted him in the quiet of his nights, was no longer a distant whisper. It was a screaming siren in his skull. How would he provide? Who was he now? The ghosts of Alina, of his sister, even the younger Wyatt with his shelved dreams, seemed to mock him from the corners of the dark room. He, Wyatt, the one who never asked for help, who stood on his own 2 feet, was now utterly, hopelessly dependent. The world had taken his legs, and with them, it felt like it had taken his very identity, leaving him stranded, staring into a black abyss at 3 a.m., completely and utterly alone with the terrifying, unvarnished truth of his broken body and shattered life. Tears, hot and unexpected, tracked paths through the grime and sweat on his temples. A silent, solitary testament to a man whose world had just been irrevocably, brutally remade. The tears stopped, not because the pain was gone, but because he was simply spent. The reservoir of despair had run dry, leaving behind a cold, desolate clarity. This wasn't a bad dream he could wake from or a temporary setback. This was the raw, unvarnished truth of his new life. The mill, the heavy steel, the reliable thrum of his own strong legs beneath him, it was all gone. But in that vast, echoing silence of his shattered world, something stubborn, something deep down and utterly Wyatt, flickered. A single word, unspoken but firm as any girder he'd ever bolted, formed in his mind. Enough. Enough of the self-pity. Enough of staring into the black. This wasn't how his story was going to end, not with him lying here, a broken, helpless wreck. He didn't know what was next. He didn't have a plan, not a single damn blueprint. But he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he couldn't stay where he was, mentally or physically. He might not be able to stand, but he wasn't dead. Not yet. He wouldn't be counted out. He wouldn't let them pack him away like some discarded tool. The morning light, stark and unforgiving, crept through the window, painting stripes across the sterile white walls. The nurses came and went, their voices soft, their eyes pitying. Physical therapists spoke in gentle, practiced tones about learning to live again. Wyatt just stared, his jaw tight. Live again? He hadn't stopped living. He just had to figure out a new way to do it. His gaze drifted. He looked at the bed frame, an assembly of cold steel and plastic. He saw the articulated arm holding his IV bag, the way the locking mechanisms engaged, the angles of the supports. His steelworker's eye, honed over decades of inspecting structures for flaws and strengths, began to engage almost instinctively. It was a familiar comfort, this analytical way of seeing the world, even if his world was now confined to a hospital room. He tried to shift his weight, to push himself up just an inch. Nothing. The frustration was a hot coal in his gut, but it quickly gave way to a cold, calculating resolve. Okay. So brute force, his old friend, was out of the picture. What else did he have? He looked at his hands, still strong, still calloused, still capable of holding a pencil. And his mind, that restless, problem-solving engine, was still whirring. He watched the hospital staff move, watched how the cleaning carts were designed for efficiency, the clever little hinges on the bedside table. He saw the flaws, the places where a stronger joint, a better pivot, a more ergonomic handle could improve things. That first day, the nurses found him not struggling against his paralysis, but with a small, crumpled piece of paper, a napkin from his lunch tray covered in crude sketches. Lines and angles, a redesign for the bed's side rail, a more accessible tray table. They assumed it was delirium or just idle doodling. But for Wyatt, it was his first step. Not a step with his legs, but a step with his mind, a defiant reassertion of purpose. He was building, not with steel and sweat on a mill floor, but with thought and observation, finding strength in a place he'd barely considered before. It was hard, almost humiliating in its smallness, but he'd done it. He'd found a way to work, a way to create, even from the confines of his bed. The simple act of sketching, which had felt like defiance that first day, soon became its own kind of grueling labor. By the third day, the careful lines on his crumpled napkins blurred into a mess of frustrated scribbles. His hands, accustomed to the thick grip of a wrench or the smooth heft of steel, felt clumsy holding a flimsy pencil. His mind, so good at visualizing a weld or calculating the stress on a beam, found itself tangled in the delicate geometry of a simple hospital tray. "What's the point?" he muttered one afternoon, tearing a page from a notepad the nurse had optimistically given him. The design for a stronger bed crank, elegant in his head, looked like a child's scrawl on paper. The anger, usually a controlled simmer, boiled over. He wanted to feel the solid thud of a hammer, the satisfying roar of the furnace. He wanted to do, not just think. His back ached from the endless lying, his arms felt useless, and the phantom sensation in his legs was a cruel joke. He closed his eyes, the taste of ash in his mouth. Then came the physical therapy. They wheeled him into a brightly lit room filled with clanking machines and the hushed groans of other broken bodies. Young therapists with bright smiles and endless patience instructed him on exercises that felt ridiculous, humiliating. "Lift your arm, Mr. Wyatt. Just a little higher. Now hold it." He'd been able to lift half a ton of steel, and now they were celebrating him lifting a 1-pound dumbbell. The fear of weakness, always a distant hum in his mind, now throbbed like a fresh wound. He saw men his age, younger, struggling with basics he'd taken for granted his entire life. He saw resignation in their eyes, and it terrified him more than anything. There were moments, especially at 3 a.m. when the hospital was a cavern of whispers and beeping machines, that he considered simply giving up, letting the current pull him under. What was the alternative? To be an invalid, tracing lines on paper like a schoolboy? The thought of being dependent, of being a burden, was a poison in his blood. He'd never asked for a handout, not once in his life. He always pulled his own weight, and then some. Now he couldn't even pull himself out of bed. One particularly brutal morning, a week into his recovery, he pushed himself too hard during a session, trying to force his inert legs to respond. A sharp pain lanced through his side, a visceral reminder of what he'd lost. He gripped the parallel bars, his knuckles white, sweat stinging his eyes. "That's enough," he rasped, his voice raw. The therapist, a young woman named Sarah, looked at him with quiet concern. "It's okay to stop, Wyatt. We'll try again tomorrow." He hated that, hated the pity, hated the understanding. He wanted to shout, to rail against the injustice of it all, but he just swallowed the bitter pill. Later that day, back in his room, he stared at the blank notepad. The anger was still there, a hot core in his chest, but beneath it, a tiny ember of his old stubbornness began to glow. He couldn't just stop. It wasn't in him. He hadn't fought tooth and nail for 48 years to give up now. Not after he'd always been the one to finish the job, no matter how hard, no matter how late. He picked up the pencil again. His hands still ached, the lines still felt clumsy, but something was different this time. He wasn't trying to draw a perfect bed crank. He was drawing the motion of it, the leverage, the interplay of components. He started to see the chair he was in, the hospital bed, even the clumsy reacher tool, not as objects, but as problems waiting for a better solution. He was dissecting them in his mind, finding the weak points, imagining improvements. It was slow, tedious work, each sketch a battle against doubt and despair. But with each line, each shaded area, he felt a small, almost imperceptible shift. He wasn't just observing anymore, he was analyzing. Was building a new kind of strength, one line at a time. And he wasn't going to quit, not for anything. The pencil kept moving, guided by a mind that was slowly, painfully relearning its own terrain. Wyatt wasn't just observing, he was dissecting. He was taking apart the world around him, piece by agonizing piece, and imagining how he'd put it back together better. The hospital bed became a series of levers and gears. The clumsy plastic cup became a study in ergonomics. He drew, erased, drew again, his fingers stiff, his shoulders aching from the effort, but his focus absolute. Sarah, the therapist, would sometimes just stand in his doorway, watching. She didn't say much, just offered a quiet nod when he finally looked up, his eyes a little less haunted, a little more alight with a spark of something she hadn't seen before. One afternoon, he was wrestling with a sketch of a modular shelving unit for his wheelchair. Something compact, sturdy, easily accessible. He grunted in frustration, erasing a line for the 5th time. "Having trouble with your tolerances, Wyatt?" she asked gently. He blinked, surprised she'd understood what he was even trying to do. It's the pivot. Needs to swing clear but lock solid. Can't have it rattling apart just going over a speed bump. He pointed with the pencil, explaining the mechanics, the choice of material, the ideal weight distribution. It wasn't a complaint anymore, it was a technical challenge. She just smiled. Looks like you're not just drawing anymore, Wyatt. You're designing. That word, designing, landed different. He hadn't thought of it that way. He'd just been solving problems the way he always had, only now the problems were on paper instead of with a torch or a wrench. The nurses, too, noticed the change. The surly, withdrawn steelworker who only grunted in response was now the man who'd ask questions about the hospital's maintenance issues, about how their equipment was sourced, about what frustrated them most in their daily tasks. He wasn't just passing time. He was gathering intel. The anger hadn't vanished entirely, but it had been reforged into a quiet, intense curiosity, a need to understand, to improve, to build. A few weeks later, when he was finally cleared to go home, the change in him was palpable. His sister, Martha, picked him up, her face etched with a mix of relief and barely concealed worry. She'd braced herself for the quiet, broken shell of a man she'd seen in the hospital. Instead, as she pushed his wheelchair through the double doors, she found him already observing the mechanics of the automatic opener, calculating its speed, its efficiency. Took him long enough. He grumbled, but there was no real malice in it, just a familiar, dry assessment. Ought to have a faster closing cycle, save on heat. Martha just shook her head, a small, hopeful smile playing on her lips. Wyatt, you just got out. Can't you take a break from critiquing the world for 5 minutes? He just offered a half shrug, a faint echo of his old self. Someone's gotta do it. Back in his small, well-maintained house, the familiar walls felt different. Not like a tomb anymore, but like a blank canvas. His old garage, once filled with the ghosts of past projects, now beckoned. He spent hours there, sketching, researching, filling notebooks with designs for everything from modified tools to custom accessibility solutions. He found an old, battered laptop, and with Martha's help, started teaching himself basic CAD programs, his calloused fingers fumbling with the mouse, but his mind sharp and hungry. His fear of weakness hadn't disappeared, but it had morphed. It wasn't about the inability to lift anymore. It was about the fear of not being useful, of not being able to provide. But every line he drew, every problem he dissected and solved on paper chipped away at that fear. He started reaching out, not for pity, but for information. He talked to other people in wheelchairs, not to commiserate, but to understand their frustrations, their unmet needs. He saw challenges where others saw limitations, and he began to see solutions where no one else was looking. The quiet steelworker was still quiet, but his silence was no longer a sign of defeat. It was the hum of a forge, heating up, preparing to shape something new and strong from the raw materials of his own unexpected future. He was building, not with his hands alone, but with a sharpened mind and an unyielding will. A month turned into 2, then 3. The quiet hum in Wyatt's garage wasn't just research anymore. It was the sound of a purpose taking root. Martha noticed first. She dropped by with groceries, expecting to find him lost in thought, but instead she found him alive. His eyes, though still carrying the shadows of what he'd been through, now held a glint, a spark of calculation. He'd be on the phone, not asking for help, but discussing material tensile strength, lead times, the cost of specialized equipment. He de-rigged up a simple pulley system in the garage, allowing him to move materials, his thin arms now surprisingly capable in their new, precise movements. He wasn't lifting heavy steel beams anymore, no, but he was lifting his own world piece by intricate piece. The blueprints on his workbench grew from sketches into detailed, professional-looking designs, custom ramps that could be deployed by a single hand. Specialized tools for workshops, modified for accessibility without sacrificing power. Solutions for everyday problems that no one else seemed to consider. He even started fabricating prototypes in his garage, small, functional pieces, his old welding skills coming back, adapted to his new physical limitations. He'd work late into the night, the garage light a beacon in the dark, the faint smell of metal and ozone a comfort. He wasn't just passing the time, he was building something real, tangible out of the shattered pieces of his old life. One evening, Martha found him staring at a finished prototype, a compact, multi-purpose wrench he'd designed, specifically for someone with limited grip strength. He turned it over in his hand, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "This," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "is gonna change things." And it did. He started small, a single order for a modified workbench from a carpenter who'd also faced an injury. Then another, a custom-designed lift for a home. Word spread, not through fancy advertising, but through the quiet network of people who understood the value of a solution that truly worked, designed by someone who knew the struggle. Wyatt used the last of his severance, then secured a small business loan. He wasn't asking for charity. He was pitching a sound business plan born from an intimate understanding of a market no one else saw. He rented a small commercial unit, still humble but a step up from his garage. He hired a couple of young guys, fresh out of trade school, and even brought on Frank, one of his old mill buddies whose bad back had sidelined him years ago. Frank, who knew steel and hard work, found new purpose in Wyatt's vision. Wyatt, the quiet steelworker, was now the foreman, the designer, the CEO. He moved through his growing workshop, his wheelchair a part of him, an extension of his will. He didn't just tell people what to do. He showed them, his mind now the strongest tool in the shop. He'd sketch a modification on a piece of scrap metal, explain the mechanics with a clarity that came from lived experience. His old stubbornness, once a flaw, had transformed into an unyielding determination that drove the business forward, past every inevitable setback. He learned to delegate, to trust, even to ask for help when necessary, though that still didn't come easy. He found a new kind of pride, not in the sweat of his brow, but in the ingenuity of his mind. He was still building, but now he was building a legacy, one custom fabrication at a time. He was still Wyatt, same man who'd faced down the heat of the mill, but his eyes, they were different. They held the calm, unwavering focus of a man who'd seen the bottom and decided to build himself a ladder, not just for himself, but for anyone else who needed a leg up. He stood one afternoon, or rather sat, surveying the controlled chaos of his busy workshop. The clang of metal, the hiss of welders, the low hum of machinery. A young apprentice brought him a newly finished component, asking for his approval. Wyatt examined it, a nod his only verbal praise, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. He thought back to that day in the hospital, the crushing weight of uselessness. He looked at the thriving business around him, the lives he was providing for, the solutions he was creating. "Martha," he told his sister one day, watching the sunset from his front porch, a quiet contentment settling over him. "I used to think being strong meant lifting the heaviest thing, meant my back could take whatever load you put on it. Turns out, it means getting up when you can't lift anything at all and figuring